Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Liz Krueger, and I'm delighted that so many of you are joining us for the first of our 5-part lunch housing series, or lunch hour housing series. Today is our first event, how to get my landlord to make repairs. For those of you who are viewing us on Zoom or Facebook, remember that you can open up closed captioning to read along with our presentation, but you must know how to do that. So if you're on Zoom, click on live transcript in the meeting controls to start viewing closed captioning. And if you're on Facebook Live, you'll see a settings button in the bottom right-hand corner of the video. Click on CC for closed captioning to activate the process. As always, this forum is being recorded, and everyone who is RSVP'd will automatically receive an email with links to the event video and the resources that are posted in the chat within a few days, along with the presenter's PowerPoint. So even though there's going to be a lot of information shared in a 1-hour period, don't panic that you have to write everything down, because you're going to get it all sent to you in a couple of days where you can review it at your leisure. Our office often receives calls from constituents who have trouble getting repairs, whether it's a leak in the ceiling, a broken kitchen appliance, mold in the bathroom, or dealing with a broken radiator in winter. This afternoon, you're going to hear from Michael Grinthal, supervising attorney at Take Root Justice, who will review what your rights are as a tenant, strategies for getting repairs done, and how to hold your landlord accountable. Michael has been a housing attorney in New York City since 2007, including as a staff attorney at South Brooklyn Legal Services and as a supervising attorney at MFY Legal Services before joining Take Root Justice. With that, I'm turning it over to Michael. We're going to hear his presentation, and then we'll be coming back for our Q&A portion of the event. Some people have already submitted questions, and if you have others that you would like to raise, you can type it into the Q&A section of your Zoom or Facebook. We will try to get to as many as possible. We never get to them all. So with that, Michael Grinthal, thank you so much for being here with us. Michael, I
Thank
see
you.
Oh, there you are.
Yes.
Okay, great.
My apologies there. I had a brief technical problem. Thank you, Senator Krueger, and thanks to everybody who organized this event. Really excited to be here. And we're going to talk for the next half hour about what tenants in New York's rights are when it comes to services and repairs. And we're going to talk about what it takes to get repairs done when the landlord doesn't do what they're supposed to do. So first, I just want to say a word about Take Root Justice, which is the organization that I work for. We're a nonprofit free legal services provider. We provide legal research and policy support for people in New York City who are organizing to build power for tenants, for workers, for immigrants, for ordinary New Yorkers facing racial, economic, and social oppression. So let's start off with the bottom line, right? If you live in New York and you're a tenant, you have the right to safe, decent living conditions, and that includes, but is not limited to, working appliances and fixtures in your apartment, hot water, which is the landlord must pay for. Tenants cannot be made to pay for hot water, electricity, heat, and gas, which tenants may have to pay depending on what their leases say, regular extermination, repainting every 3 years or as needed, fire safety, meaning smoke and carbon monoxide detectors and sprinklers, sanitary trash storage and removal, and clean public areas of the buildings. Again, those are not the only thing that you have the right to, but those are some of the things that come up the most often that landlords fail to provide. You have the right to repairs when something is broken. New York law requires that landlords have a 24-hour phone number at which tenants can report repair needs or emergencies, and that number be posted in a public area of the building, like the lobby or the first floor hallway. You have the right to a timely response when you make complaints. If you live in a building with 9 apartments or more, the law requires that there be a live-in super or a 24-hour janitor service if the super does not live in the building. New York law gives very specific protections for when work has to be done to remove lead paint or get rid of mold, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And for all plumbing work, electricity, carpentry work, major renovation has to be done by licensed professionals. So Senator Krueger asked that we specifically talk about mold, and there's a relatively new law in New York City governing how mold has to be remediated, has to be fixed. And this is the result of, just like a lot of these rights, are the result of tenants organizing and working alongside elected officials like Senator Krueger to get these things put into law. So I saw that a few people submitted questions in advance that had to do with water leaks or mold, and these are especially difficult conditions to fix because just painting over it or just removing the mold on the surface usually does not take care of the problem. If there's an underlying problem, the mold is going to come back. And that's why we have a mold remediation law in New York. And it provides that mold remediation has to be done by a mold remediation specialist that has to be licensed by the New York Department of Labor. And they have to follow a series of steps. They have to first prepare a mold assessment and work plan. So that's an assessment not just of where the mold is, but what the underlying cause is, what needs to be done to take care of the underlying cause. And they have to provide copies of this to the landlord, which means that you can ask the landlord to provide a copy of it to you. A copy of that plan has to be kept on site. So if there's no management office inside your building, that means that a copy of the plan has to be posted somewhere publicly. They have to put up signs in the public areas of the building to let people know that mold remediation is going on, who's doing it, and what number they can call if they have a question or a complaint. The workers who remove the mold have to use only disinfectants from a list that are approved by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So that has to do with the safety of you and the other people who live in the building. And after the mold is taken care of, they have to prepare another written assessment to say what they did and whether they were able to get to all the mold. And again, this has to be given to the owner, which means you can ask the owner for it. Right. So that's all well and good. So we know about the rights that we have as tenants in New York. But as I'm sure all of you are very aware, what the law says should happen and what actually happens are two very different things. So we're going to spend the rest of our time here talking about how we get repairs done when the landlord is not doing the right thing. And I'm going to talk about 3 main tactics, 3 things that we can do as New York City tenants to enforce our rights to repairs. So the first is to bring a case against the landlord in housing court. The second is to withhold rent. And the third is to make a complaint with the Division of Homes and Community Renewal, a state agency. And I just want to say again, we have these means, we have these strategies, we have these rights today because tenants fought for these in the past. If we go back several decades, tenants couldn't do these things. And it's due to tenants organizing and fighting for it that we have these rights. So if you've got a problem needing repair in your apartment, the very first thing to do is to document the problem, right? So you want to notify the landlord in writing of the problem. You want to call 311 to get an inspector to come out and document the problem. And you want to document it yourself in any way you can, such as by taking a photograph if it's a condition that is visible, right? Like a hole or mold or cracked plaster, right? You want to keep a journal of when the conditions first appeared, when you told the landlord about it, what their response was, if any, when you told the landlord about it again and again and again and again. And specifically when you're having a problem with heat or hot water, um, you want to keep a really detailed daily log of when the heat went out, what the temperature was on a particular day, because as you know, heat outages are very hard to pin down. You can't take a picture of them. You might call 311 and get an inspector to come out, but they come out on a day when the heat is working or a day when it's warm out. So the best evidence that you're probably going to be able to have is to keep a log and every day get a thermometer and every day look at it and post what the thermometer reading was. And this is something you can use later on in court. When you call 311 to get an inspection, a lot of people have had experience calling 311 and not getting very much done by that. And it's true that if HPD comes out and they do an inspection and they say, yes, there's a violation here, and they place a violation and tell the landlord about it, that won't necessarily get the landlord to act. Sometimes that's enough. But we're under no illusions that landlords are just going to do the right thing. The real reason that you want to call 311 and get an inspection is that that record of violations becomes crucially important if you go to housing court, if you withhold rent, or if you go to DHCR with a complaint. That's the real reason to call 311, is you're going to need that record of violations if you take any of these actions to enforce your right to repairs. If you call 311, it means that they're going to give you a time when the inspector comes out. You're going to need to be home to let them in. If no one comes out or if the inspection is missed, you may have to call to do it again. So calling 311 to get an inspection is not a lot of fun. I'm gonna acknowledge that right up front. It's not a lot of fun and it can be really cumbersome, but those violations that record of violations is so crucial to being able to enforce your right to repairs. So it's really worth the bother to get it done. Right? So the first thing you want to do is notify the landlord in writing, right? And it's important that you do it in writing, because if the landlord fails to do repairs, it's going to be important that you have a paper trail showing that the landlord knew about the condition. And here's just a sample email or letter that you might give to your landlord about conditions. You don't have to follow this template, but I highlighted in color some of the key things to include, right? So in blue, numbered 1, 2, and 3, specific list of repairs. And you want to be as specific as possible, right? Where, which room, what exactly is broken about it. Again, you're informing the landlord, but you're also creating a paper trail that the landlord was on notice of the repairs that need to be done, right? Obviously, the landlord's going to have to come and get access. And it's a good idea to tell them up front when you're available, right? For the most part, the law only requires that landlords come and do repairs during business hours, unless it's a serious emergency. So much as we would all like to be able to get them to come on a Saturday when we don't have to go to work, unfortunately, it's going to be necessary to provide access between 9 and 5 on a weekday. And if it's just not possible for you to provide access, There are other ways, such as, giving the key to a neighbor that you trust or to the super for a short period of time. That can be really, I understand people being reluctant to do that. But there are ways to strategize and be able to let the landlord into the apartment, even if you can't be there. You should ask the landlord for a written response, because again, you're creating a paper trail. Uh, the landlord is required by New York City law to give you at least 1 week's notice before they come. They can't just knock on the door and demand to come in. They can't tell you we're going to be there tomorrow. They've got to give you 1 week's notice. And then finally, what you want from them is to know when they're going to come, who's going to come, so that if somebody shows up at your door, you don't have to guess as to whether they're really from the landlord. Also, so that you can gauge, if this is the kind of work that requires a licensed professional like plumbing or electrical work, are they sending a plumber or an electrician? Or are they just sending the super, right? And finally, is there anything you need to do to prepare the apartment for them, so that when they come, there's nothing that stands in the way of their doing the work, and they can't say, oh, we forgot to tell you, you have to move your furniture away from the wall. We'll have to come back in 3 months. Okay, so now we're assuming that none of that worked, that the repairs were not done, or they weren't done fully, or they were done and the thing broke again. Happens all too often. These are the steps you can take to escalate, to bring more pressure to bear, to enforce your right to repairs. So the first one we're going to talk about is a housing court case. It's called an HP action. HP stands for housing part. Going back 40 years, when there was no housing court, there was just a housing part of other courts. It doesn't actually make sense anymore as a name, but the name stuck. So an HP action is a case where tenants ask a housing court judge to order the landlord to fix all housing code violations, right? There are pros and cons, like all strategies. One is that you're on the offense, right? If you lose the case, the worst that can happen is you don't get that court order, right? Nothing bad can happen to you. You can also get other tenants in your building involved. The law allows a group of tenants to bring a housing court case, and that is a really powerful way to do it. It is the fastest of the three strategies we're going to talk about. And you can get a court order, which is a powerful thing to get. The cons are that you have to go to court, right? That costs time and energy. You're going to have to take off from work to go to court. You might have to go to court more than once, right? Being honest, if you're not a regulated tenant, right, a rent stabilized or rent controlled tenant or covered by the good cause law, it's very possible that the landlord could retaliate against you. Retaliation is illegal. There is a law specifically saying that a landlord cannot retaliate against a tenant by trying to evict them or not renewing their lease because the landlord made a complaint or went to housing court. But that's not to say that the landlord won't do it. I want to be honest and real up front, right? Most of these things that we're going to talk about may make your landlord angry. And that is not a reason not to fight for your rights. It is a reason to plan ahead. It's a really good reason to involve your neighbors because there's power in numbers. And it's a good reason before you do this to reach out to an organization that helps with tenant organizing or a legal services office like mine, but also like Legal Services of NYC or the Legal Aid Society, to help you assess your rights and think about things that might happen down the road. This option does not involve you being able to get any kind of monetary compensation for having gone without repairs. The HP judge doesn't have the authority to order the landlord to pay you money, which is different from the other two strategies we'll talk about. So again, an HP action is a lawsuit in housing court brought by tenants against the landlord to order the landlord to do repairs or stop harassing the tenants. The way that you start an HP action is you go to housing court in Manhattan. That's at 110 Center Street. And you're going to go to the second floor because that's where the clerk's office for the housing court is. They will give you forms to fill out, and it's pretty straightforward. You do not need a lawyer to do this. You don't need to be an expert in the law. You just fill out the forms. There is an excellent organization called Housing Court Answers that keeps a table staffed right there in the clerk's office with the purpose of helping people to fill out legal forms. The things you're going to want to have ready are the names of everybody bringing the case and the apartment numbers, the names and addresses of the landlord and managing agent and super and anybody else who's in charge of the building. You can look that up on HPD's website. You can look up any apartment building in New York City by address, and it will show you the names of the owner and the managing agent and the super. And those are the people you're going to want to name as the respondents or defendants in the case. And of course, you want to have a list of all the repairs that are needed, right? There is a $45 fee for starting a case in housing court, but if you aren't able to pay that, you can let the clerk know. They will give you another form to fill out, stating that you are low income or have limited income, and the judge can then authorize the fee to be waived. So I encourage you to do that. And then finally, once you've filed the papers, you're going to have to serve them on the landlord, and the clerk will give you instructions on how to do that. And then when you've done that, congratulations, you have brought a court case. You sued somebody. Now, what typically happens in those cases is that a landlord, usually if there's a violation on record from HPD, the judge will usually just look that up on their own computer and say, I see there's a violation here. The landlord has to correct it. And because of that, landlords usually, if there's a violation of record with HPD, will just agree to correct the violation. So again, this is where all that calling 311 and the patience with that pays off. In housing court, if a judge sees that there's a violation listed with HPD, they're going to assume that the condition is real. And if they don't see a violation, it's a lot harder to convince them that the violation exists, though you can with things like photographs and records. But if you can, I'm going to say, I can't say this enough, you want to get those violations placed with HPD by calling 311. So once the judge has issued that order, or more likely the landlord has just signed an agreement saying they'll do the repairs, there's going to be a time limit on that, the deadline by which they have to do the repairs. And if they don't do the repairs by that deadline, then you've got to take more actions to enforce your rights. And what happens is somebody who disobeys a court order is in contempt of court. So a landlord who doesn't do the repairs by the ordered deadline is in contempt of court. But it is on us, the tenants, to go back to court. You file an order to show cause, and we don't have time today to do a deep dive into what that looks, but I will say, just like when you start the case, you go to the clerk, you tell them what you want to do, and they'll give you a form. Form is pretty straightforward. And again, Housing Court Answers, excellent organization, lots of experienced and knowledgeable people will be at a table there in the clerk's office, and they can help you fill it out. So if you go back to court for contempt and the judge again sees that HPD violation is still there in the record, they can, at that point, make the landlord pay a lot more in civil penalties or fines to HPD. And at this point, they actually can give money damages to you as a tenant. So that's an exception to what I said earlier. I will say it's quite rare that judges actually order money damages because of contempt, but they do it, right? At a certain point, they can say, in order to punish somebody for violating a court order, they're going to make them pay damages, right? So that is, I recognize, a very quick and skeletal overview of an HP action. We don't have time, unfortunately, today to really get into the nitty-gritty of it, which is why I suggest that if you're thinking of bringing an HP action, and I do encourage people to do it, I think it's a great tool that we have, to give a call to the legal services office in your neighborhood just to be able to talk to somebody and get some advice on how best to start it. Okay, so now we're going to move on to another enforcement mechanism that we have as tenants in New York. And this one, again, we have this right because tenants fought for it. The law allows tenants in New York to withhold rent if there are conditions in their apartment that aren't fixed, or if you don't have full use of the apartment, you're not getting everything that you're paying for, you can withhold rent. Like any other strategy, this has pros and it has cons. The pros are, this is the most powerful leverage you have. Your rent is the most powerful leverage you have, especially if you get together with your neighbors. And through this method, you may actually be able to get a percentage of your rent abated or deducted for the time that you had to live in an apartment that was not up to what you were supposed to be paying for, right? The cons for this are that if you withhold rent, it's likely that your landlord will take you to housing court in an eviction case for non-payment, right? So this is serious. It's not something to undertake lightly. And in the end, even if the judge orders a rent abatement, which is a victory, right? It's important to know that if the judge says, okay, I'm deducting 40% from your rent, which is a really powerful win, that still leaves the rest of the rent to be paid. That still leaves 60% of the rent to be paid. So the absolute most important thing you can do when withholding rent is to make sure that you have every penny of that rent set aside, so that if you either resolve things with the landlord or you go to housing court and win, you will be able to pay whatever is left over after that rent abatement is done. If you have that money set aside, you've got power. Rent is what landlords care about more than anything, and that is your power. So the way to withhold rent is, first, you notify the landlord in writing of the condition, as we discussed, and you let them know that you'll be withholding your rent until it's fixed. And you want to have proof that you gave the landlord this written notice. So an email is great. It's something that you can print out and prove that the landlord was sent it. If you're sending it by mail, we recommend always sending communications with the landlord by certified mail. Return receipt requested, you get documentation that they got it. And then go ahead and set aside all of the rent each month again, right? The landlord is likely to take you to housing court. You're going to have to pay whatever's left over after the abatement. You want to be able to do that and be safe, right? Now, the most powerful thing that we can do by far as tenants is to withhold rent as a group. A rent strike. A rent strike is when a group of tenants, some critical mass, some critical percentage of the building withholds their rent together. For obvious reasons, it's far more powerful than withholding your rent by yourself. If you and your neighbors are considering a rent strike, talk to a local tenant organization, which is going to vary based on what neighborhood you're in, but many neighborhoods in New York City have organizations that provide tenant organizers and help you organize a tenant association. It's also important to talk to a lawyer, again, even if that just means calling up the hotline of one of our legal services organizations and talking to somebody and talking about your specific situation, and they can give you advice for that. It's important to plan carefully, make sure that you are organized and that everybody who's doing the rent strike really knows what they're getting into and are committed and plan to put their rent aside together. And we recommend that everybody put their rent into a single account that the tenant association opens up. That way, everybody knows which rent, how much rent you've got set aside. You know who's really participating in the rent strike. And you're able to look at that pool of money and say, oh, you know what? We're holding $80,000 that the landlord wants and needs. That's very powerful. The Right to Counsel New York City Coalition has an excellent rent strike toolkit. And I see that Dana just put that in the chat. I highly recommend looking at that. It's got a lot of wisdom from a lot of organizers who got together and wrote that document from their experience going through rent strikes. Okay, the third and easiest route you have to enforce your right to repairs is if you are rent stabilized, and unfortunately this is only for people who are rent stabilized, to make a complaint to DHCR, Division of Homes and Community Renewal, which is the state agency that, among other things, oversees the rent stabilization code. And they allow you to make a complaint that you have code violations in your apartment, and they can reduce your rent. They can issue an order reducing your rent until those violations are corrected. Pros and cons, again, the pros of this is everything is done by mail or even submitting things online. It is the easiest of all of these strategies. It takes the least time and you don't have to miss work. There's no court appearance. There's no in-person appearance for anything. And it does lead to a small rent reduction. Now, the rent reduction is, according to the law, they roll back your rent by the last lease increase. So it's set, right? It's not based on what the violations are, how long you've had them. It just rolls back the last rent increase you got. And that stays in place until the landlord submits documentation showing that they've corrected the violation. And when that happens, your rent will go back up. The cons are that this is very slow. DHCR is very slow and very backed up in processing various complaints. So it can take months. It can even take a year, right? Whereas the other two strategies that we talked about, they're pretty fast and they get the landlord's attention right away. And of course, this is only for rent stabilized tenants. It's not available for people who are in market rate units. It's not available to people who are covered by the good cause law. It's not available to people living in public housing. The way that you do it, again, like everything else, you start by notifying the landlord in writing of the condition. You call 311 and get HPD to place a violation. And then you fill out the online complaint form, which is at that link that was just posted in the chat. And when you do that, you actually have to also submit a copy of the written request you sent to the landlord. They want to see that you did that. Now, DHCR will then send a copy of that complaint to the landlord. You don't have to send it to them yourself. And the landlord responds. And then DHCR sends you the landlord's response and asks you to respond. You go back and forth, you go back and forth. This is one of the reasons that it takes a long time. DHCR may send an inspector to verify that the conditions are there. And ultimately, if the DHCR finds the condition remains, they'll reduce the rent, again, by the latest increase. And your rent stays at that lowered amount until the landlord proves to DHCR that they've done the repair. So, maybe that's 3 months, maybe that's 3 years, okay? Once the landlord does show that they've made the repair, your rent goes back up to whatever it's supposed to be based on the current lease. Finally, these are some of the websites that we've talked about during this presentation. Some of them have been posted in the chat. Senator Krueger's office is going to make this slideshow available, including all of these links. I want to point out a couple of them that we didn't talk about that are especially useful. The second point on there is ACRIS. I am, as I always do, forgetting what it stands for, but it is the city's online database of all the deeds and mortgages for all the properties in the city. So you can find out who your landlord is by looking that up. You can also see what kind of mortgage they've got, if that's interesting to you. There is an excellent group called JustFix.nyc. They have a website, also an app for your phone, that allows you to make complaints to HPD online. It allows you to generate a letter to your landlord about conditions. And they also have this great service called WhoOwnsWhat, where they get data from a whole bunch of different databases that the city runs. It can help you find out not only who owns your building, but what else they might own, what other buildings they might own. Let's see. You can also, I think we mentioned this, look up your apartment on HPD by address. You can find out who owns it. You can also find out what other violations have been placed and whether any violations that you got have been, the landlord is claiming that they've fixed. Okay. So that brings us to the end of the slideshow. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think we're going to take some questions. Am I right,
Yes,
Jennifer?
indeed. Hi, I'm back with you. That was a great presentation, Michael. Thank you so much. We have lots of questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible in the next 25 minutes. Just a couple quickly that came up while you were talking. You were explaining about mold issues. What if you are a co-op or condo, either a renter in that kind of building or actually a co-op condo owner? Who's responsible for the mold in your apartment and getting it fixed?
Right. So for most of these questions, there's going to be an answer that is what the law says is supposed to happen, and then another answer that's what will probably happen. So what the law says is supposed to happen, if you're a co-op or condo owner, you're responsible, you probably are aware, you're responsible for repairs within your own apartment. The co-op or the condo association is responsible for things that are coming from outside your apartment, and not from somebody else's apartment. So something that's coming from the building systems. So if there's a plumbing riser that is leaking into your apartment and causing mold, that's on the co-op or condo association to repair. If you have mold, say in your bathroom because of your water use in the apartment, that's for you to fix. Um, the reality of what's going to happen is you're probably going to get into an argument with your co-op board or condo association over what the cause is, and what the underlying cause is of a water leak or mold is not always obvious. So you may be in a position where you have to hire a mold assessor to come in and do an assessment and say this is where the mold is coming from. And then if you're able to do it, then you may be able to deduct that from your maintenance or your condo fees once you've proven that you just spent money on something that was actually the responsibility of the co-op or condo.
Got it. Okay, so let's go to some of the many questions that came in advance. Um, let's see. Are there any state agencies it makes sense for to report my complaints to? Or is it really sort of the city ones?
So if you're rent stabilized or rent controlled, DHCR, for the reasons we just discussed, they are specially set up for this. Other than that, pretty much all code enforcement is city, right? So HPD, the Department of Buildings, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, those are pretty much everybody who oversees things that can go wrong physically in your housing.
And we certainly hear this situation quite a bit. If you believe that the lack of repairs is actually intentional by the landlord as a form of harassment or an effort to try to make you leave because basically you're creating an inhabitable situation, are there others to be filing complaints with, beyond just my landlord isn't making the repairs, but my landlord is actually strategizing to make this place unlivable and force me out?
great and really important question. We've got a tenant harassment law in New York City. And I know I sound like a broken record, but we got a tenant harassment law because people fought for it. Um, and it is specifically aimed at, what people had in mind when they first wrote it and first passed it was this kind of situation where a landlord just passively tries to drive you out by not doing repairs. So that is harassment. And when you file an HP action in housing court, you can include harassment as part of the case, just like you include the water leak or the radiator that's not working. And the law is great in this way that it says once you've shown that a landlord has, for a long time, failed to repair something, the court then has to presume that the landlord was doing this to harass you. That means they start out with the assumption that this is harassment. And the landlord's got the burden to show that it's not, right? They could go in and be like, no, this was just a really tricky water leak. We've tried and we're not able to fix it. We're not delaying. But the law is set up to put the burden on the landlord to show that this is not intended to harass.
So are you obligated to report the need for repairs to someone? And if you don't, can you be evicted by your landlord for failing to tell him to make the repairs?
That's
Him or
interesting.
her, not to be fair.
I've never heard some. No, you can't be evicted for failing to make a complaint or report something to the landlord. I mean, if you caused the problem, then I think you would have a duty to let the landlord know about it. And people do face eviction for damaging their apartments. But if you just notice it, you're under no obligation to do anything.
And some people have raised that if they point out something is damaged, they're afraid that the landlord will increase their rent once they come and fix it. One example was a sink coming off of the wall,
Mhm.
other kinds of equipment breaking down. Is that a basis for the landlord to raise your rent?
The answer is different depending on whether you're rent stabilized or not. If you're rent stabilized, the answer is just flat out no.
Yep.
They can't do that. A landlord can raise the rent for major building updates like a new roof, but they cannot do it for something like repairing your sink or really any repair in your apartment. If your market rate, uh, the difficulty is that when the landlord goes to renew your lease, they can give you any rent they want, for pretty much any reason they want. And so yes, they could say, I want to raise your rent. They can't do it in the middle of a lease. The lease is a contract and it says what your rent is, and they can't change their minds. But a landlord can raise your rent for pretty much any reason they want when it's time to renew the lease. The big elephant in the room right there is we have this new good cause eviction law. And many people who are market rate tenants are now covered by the good cause eviction law. Figuring out whether you're covered and what your rights are is a whole other and probably longer than this presentation. But there are some good write-ups and information out there about how it works. And I'll share some with Senator Krueger's office so they can share it with you.
Great. So I'm merging a couple of questions. I've had really horrendous mold in my apartment or leaks, and the landlord has come in and done sort of patch repair, but it's all come back and be worse. One, do they have to come back and try again? And two, if they say, well, this is really a big deal, you're going to have to get out for a while for me to do it, do they have an obligation to pay for me to stay somewhere else while they're making those repairs?
Yeah, let me answer. I think that's two parts. Let me answer. The first part is what do I do if the mold keeps coming back? First thing I would do is ask the landlord for a copy of the assessment report that the mold remediator did before and after they did something about the mold. So you can see exactly what they did. And there should be a report in that about what's causing the mold, right? So if all they did was paint over it, then you know that they are not doing what they're supposed to do because mold comes from somewhere. And then if you have that information, that's really helpful in doing something like bringing an HP action, because then you're able to say the condition that needs to be repaired is the leak in the water pipe, in between me and the upstairs apartment, rather than just make it so that I don't see mold when I look at the ceiling. Um, the second part, about if you have to relocate. The Bear Law says that if you're not able to stay in your apartment for a certain period of time because of conditions, the landlord is not obligated to pay for you to stay somewhere else. They're actually only obligated to reduce your rent for that month. So if you're out for 3 days, the law just says they have to reduce your rent by 10%. And that's not very good. And that's something we should fix, because a 10% reduction in rent is nowhere near what it will cost to stay in a hotel for 3 nights. We are often able to negotiate with landlords to get them to pay to put you somewhere else. For large landlords, it's easier because they own lots of other apartments and they're more likely to have a vacant one they can put you in.
Several of these, I'm elderly or disabled. I only have a bathtub, which is dangerous or impossible for me to actually get into. Is there any obligation for my landlord to replace it with a shower?
Yes, there is. We have both federal, state, and city laws that require landlords to provide accommodations to people with disabilities, reasonable accommodations, and putting in an accessible walk-in tub or walk-in shower is actually like a very common reasonable accommodation. It's hard to believe that they could ever come up with a reason that they wouldn't have to do it. We have an agency in the city called the New York City Commission for Human Rights, where you can make a complaint if you've asked for a reasonable accommodation and the landlord wouldn't give it. And they uh, actually are quite good about reaching out to landlords and trying to get them to comply with the law before going ahead with a lengthier process.
Great, great. That's important for so many people.
Yeah.
What about when the repair is really needed by the building, not necessarily your individual apartment? So a couple of different examples. They've never fixed the intercom system. They haven't fixed the boiler and you're not getting heat, etc. Is there a different strategy when it's the building but not your individual unit per se?
Same strategies all apply. When you rent an apartment, you are also paying for use of the common areas, having a front door that locks, stairs that are safe to climb. So those are all included in the repairs that you have the right to. All the strategies that we talked about, you can use for violations in the common areas or to building-wide systems like electricity or plumbing that affect you. If it is something that affects the whole building, I really encourage talking to your tenants talking to your neighbors who are also affected, and getting together. Every one of those strategies is so much more powerful when you do them as a group.
Got it. If you change the tub to a shower, would they be able to file for a major capital improvement, make your rent go up?
No, first of all, it's nowhere near a major
Right.
capital improvement. Major capital improvements are like, again, like a new roof or a new furnace. Second, they can't get a major capital improvement just for complying with the disability rights law.
Great. So is it legally, I'm sorry, do apartments have to have air vents in the bathroom? Is it illegal if they don't?
You got me on that one. I would have to look up the housing code, which is extremely long and dense, so not something I'm able to do while I'm on this call, but I will look it up later.
Thank you. Do windows have to open and close?
Yes, they very much do, both because there are, the building code includes, air and light, and also, depending on where you are, your windows are probably listed as escape routes under the fire code.
Can you make a complaint that something is just too old, even if it's still working, like a 30-year-old refrigerator or windows that date back 100 years, if they're opening and closing?
If the thing works, then they meet the code. But I'm guessing from the question that actually maybe, they work in a basic way, but they're sort of failing around the edges. So if that's the case, yeah, it might be a code violation depending on how badly they're failing.
Uh, What if I'm a month-to-month tenant? So I don't really have a lease with the kinds of protections
Yeah.
we think come with a lease.
Yeah. Well, you still have standing legally to do two of those strategies. You can take the landlord to housing court, you can withhold rent. You can't, you're not rent stabilized, so you can't make a complaint to DHCR. You are in a vulnerable position if you're a month-to-month tenant, in that the landlord can refuse to renew your tenancy at any time with 30 days notice. Well, or 90 days notice if you lived there more than 2 years.
So,
Mentioning,
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
go ahead, go ahead.
There is it is illegal for the landlord to refuse to renew your month-to-month tenancy in retaliation, right? We've got a great law. It's written out that way. It is really hard to prove in court whether something is retaliatory because you have to be able to show what the landlord's intentions were, which means you have to get into showing what they were thinking. So it's a great retaliation law, anti-retaliation law. It's just always hard to make it work in court. If you are month to month, again, I would encourage you to, if your building has 11 or more units, you are probably covered by the good cause eviction law, which means you have the right to a lease.
Um, sorry. Suppose my landlord is actually, or his contractor has caused damage to my apartment while they're doing some kind of bigger major capital improvement on the building. Is there a different procedure for me to follow to try to get the repairs, or is it the same story?
To get the repairs done, same things. Separately, the landlord is going to apply for the MCI. They have to apply to DHCR to get approval to raise the rent. You're going to get a notice of that and an invitation to submit opposition. Landlords actually can't get an MCI rent increase if there are major violations, what they call level C, or immediately hazardous violations in the building. So I would say you should put all this into an opposition to the MCI when you get the notice of it.
And I guess I'll make this the last one, maybe two more. So they did an MCI. They supposedly fixed things like put in new windows. Then there's some kind of storm and it breaks the windows and the screens. Am I supposed to have to replace those, or am I still to have to be paying a rent increase because of the MCI when the work that in theory was done and I'm paying for got undone, not by me, but by nature?
Good question. The answer to the first part is no, you don't have to do the repair. Any repair. Landlords have to do repairs, and that's both state and city law. The particular scenario that you just described has a bad answer, which is that if the work done for the MCI was legit work, it was done and it was done competently, you're stuck with the MCI, even if, some act of God comes along and ruins it again. If the work was not done properly in the first place, right? They put in new windows and they just leak the first time a rain comes, then you're probably still in the period where the landlord is applying for the MCI, because DHCR does not move quickly. And absolutely, it is a basis for denying an MCI if the work was not actually successful or completed.
Thank you. I'll just throw one more in. So for some reason, it was determined that electrical outlets in my rent regulated unit were not, more illegal outlets. I'm going to say didn't meet the electric code. And so they were taken out. does my landlord have to replace that outlet or outlets with a legitimate outlet?
The answer lies somewhere in the building code, and I do not know offhand. I'm sorry.
That's
It's not
okay.
that they have to replace the outlets one for one. It's that there's something somewhere in the code about like the how many outlets there should be. And I admit I do not know that offhand.
Well, we like to ask stump the guest questions, so I appreciate that you are not 100% perfect, but pretty damn perfect, based on the presentation and the answers to the questions and the sheer volume of materials that you are providing us to have people be able to go forward and help themselves as they confront these issues. So with that, I'm just going to thank you again profusely for your being with us today, for all the materials. And again, everyone, remember, we're sending you all the materials that were in chat, that were in the power presentation, and the actual tape of the presentation. So we won't be sending out a test for you to see how many of you got it right the first time. I really do thank you, Michael, so much for your work and your organization's work every day. There's just endless issues that keep coming up for the millions of tenants in our city. I want to remind everybody before we go, we have 2 more virtual event series happening literally right around the corner. So the next session of our virtual housing lunch hour series will be Thursday, 2 days from now. And it's called You've Fallen Behind on Your Rent, Now What? Presented by my friend Jenny Laurie from Housing Court Answers. Session 3 will be December 3rd, Appearing in Housing Court Without a Lawyer, a Perpetual Challenge. Session 4 on December 5th is co-op and condo owners' rights and resources. Because guess what? We have people who are owners who also hit up against all kinds of issues for themselves. And then I have a second series. This is a busy time of year. I want to remind everybody about my virtual older adult resource fair. We used to do it in person, but then because of COVID, we had to stop that. You can't put 600 or 700 seniors in the same place at the same time. Not a good public health move. So now we do it over multiple days virtually. And our first session will be December 6th, focusing on making connections while being solo and aging. December 12th session will focus on arts and culture opportunities for older New Yorkers, and there are a lot. This is the great city of New York. And our final virtual session on December 13th will offer legal resources. Links to the RSVP for all of these events are on the chat. I want to wish everybody a very happy Thanksgiving if I don't see you online before that. I want to hope you all have a good rest of the day. And again, Michael, thank you so much for being with us. Take care, everybody.